Hi, welcome to another Toothpickings web interview. I'm Brian. I blog as Toothpickings and I web interview as myself. Listen, started this thing because of a pandemic that created a lockdown, so I figured why not do vampire interviews? Everybody else is performing music live. This is how I can contribute. However, my locality has started to experiment with letting us all become zombie fodder. I mean, let us go back to work. So I don't know. This might be the last one of these I'm able to do because I might have to go back to my real job soon. But I gotta say, if this is the last Toothpickings web interview, I'm gonna be proud of this one. Hans Corneel De Roos is the guest today. And boy, if you don't know his name, you're gonna remember it after today. Hans is the super sleuth of Dracula studies. And I gotta say, I admire this guy a lot because, like me, he doesn't hold a doctorate or professorship or anything. He was just a guy who was a photographer and he got interested in Dracula and he dove in with 2 feet, 2 hands, and a good brain, and he researched the hell out of things. I'm not gonna list it here, but holy shit, when we get into this interview and he starts talking about some of the nutball discoveries he came up with just from the text and the secondary documents that went along with the text, like Bram Stoker's notes and some of the translations he found. Wow, what a service this guy has done to the world of vampire studies and Dracula studies in particular. I wore my Dracula tee with the vintage book cover design on it just for Hans. I don't know if he's going to be impressed, but I wanted to wear my best for him. You are going to be impressed by the things he has to say. Stick around. I think you're going to find this really intriguing. Hans Corneel De Roos, or De Roos, as you might say it in Dutch, thank you so much for being on this webcast today.
Thank you for hosting me, for interviewing me.
Well, you came at Dracula studies in an interesting way. You started out in photography and rights management. How did you go from that to Dracula studies?
There was a step through photography, and that is that I was making series in my studio of photo series based on literature, like Edgar Allan Poe or Decamerona or Grimm's fairy tales. And then I met a model at the beginning of 2010 in Vienna, and she wanted to do something gothic, something about dark mysteries of the 19th century. And we talked about Jekyll and Hyde, we talked about Frankenstein, and then finally we agreed on Dracula. And when the series was ready, I wanted to make a book of it, and I needed some kind of introduction and text. And I thought, okay, let's research, let's find some maps so that the people can see where the whole action is taking place. And I wanted to have a map where the location of Castle Dracula was marked, but there was no one in the whole literature that really found it. There were some essays about it, but they were not very accurate. So then I started searching as an illustration for the book for the location of Castle Dracula, and that was my entry, so to say. I worked 3 months just to find that very spot on the old maps of the Habsburg military regime, and wrote while I was researching, and that was in the Ultimate Dracula. It was an essay called the Dracula Maps. When it was ready and the whole book was already ready for print, I also discovered the identity of Count Dracula, the person that Bram Stoker may have been in his mind when he was referring to Dracula and the other of his race.
Well, let's address both of those one at a time, because a lot of people already have an idea in their head of what Castle Dracula is. They might say, "Oh, it's Bran Castle," or it's the one that begins with a P that I won't try to pronounce. But you found
Pornari.
Pornari. But you said you found something completely different. What did you find?
What I found was the location that Stoker had in mind. He has also used maps quite precise maps. He had coordinates of the region, and he picked a empty mountain somewhere in the Kalimani Mountains, not in the Borgo Mountains, where the castle in his imagination should be located. So he had inspiration, I think, from other buildings, like maybe Bran Castle, maybe the castle in Scotland that is talked about a lot now, Slains Castle. But he could not take an existing building, because then everyone would run there and say, oh, there's no vampire here, you're making this up. So he put another location on the map where Jonathan Harker is traveling. And that's what I discovered.
And you found it kind of an interesting way, because you found some longitudinal notes that he had written down. Is that right?
Yeah, but that was only in the very end. That only confirmed what I found out before.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize it was backwards like that.
Yeah, I was already, also with that essay, I was already done writing it. And then I discovered this note. I said, okay, let's make one last check. If Stoker in his notes anywhere puts down an exact geographic location that we have not examined yet. And that's confirmed my theory. But the clues for finding it, how to go along in the first place, they were in the novel. So if you read the text of the novel, you can already, let's say, pin it down to an area of maybe 4 or 5 kilometers in diameter.
When you were starting that research, did you have an idea in your head of what you thought you might find? And were you surprised by what you actually did find?
I was surprised, of course, but I didn't have an idea in my head. There was an essay by Walker and Wright of '97, and they tried to follow the route of Jonathan Harker, and they landed somewhere in Moldavia in the end. So I knew that was not correct, because Dracula's castle was supposed to be in Transylvania. When I studied the novel, you have several clues there. Maybe I can explain about that. Mm-hmm. The first one is the time schedule of Harker's trip. He starts at 2 in the afternoon, I think. The stagecoach is leaving from Bistritza, and he drives towards this meeting point in the Borgo Pass. So we know that the duration of this travel was from 2 o'clock in the afternoon till, I think, 9 o'clock he arrived there. He was 1 hour early before the agreed time. So if you calculate from Bistritza the route you can find on the map through the Borgo Mountains, if you calculate, let's say, 7.5 kilometers per hour, about 5 miles per hour, you must be away 35 miles from the town of Bistritz. And that brings you already to the Borgo Pass. There's a little spot there. It was called Tihucha at that time. You find it not anymore today, but you can find it on the old military maps of that region. And from there, the novel says he goes with the driver. The driver drives in circles around the pass. He's very confused about that, but he checks it by marking some salient point. And only at 12 o'clock at midnight, when St. George Eve is starting, then the driver takes a route to the right, a sharp turn to the right, while they were driving to the far end of the pass. That means they were driving in the direction of Bukovina, and then they go to the right. So you already know the direction then, it's southeast. And that leads you into the Borgo Mountains, but the whole time frame again says that he was with a count for about 4 hours. And because starting to drive at midnight, The Count goes to his lair at 5:30 in the morning, at early dawn. They had some late sip. So he's been driving 4 hours. So in that time, you don't stay in the Borgo Mountains. You go already south of it, and you get to the Kalimani Mountains. Now you would need a map to understand maybe what I'm talking about. I can send you a map that illustrates that.
If someone were hearing all this and saying, well, all we're doing is taking the times and the distances that Stoker wrote in the book randomly, and then we're just calculating that out and finding whatever happened to be there. But what drives me crazy is that there's something special about that mountain that corresponds to the unpublished text that Stoker had, the draft version, where the mountain that was underneath Castle Dracula was a volcano.
Yeah, that's right. That was there were three lines, I think, that were deleted from the typed manuscript. He had the typed manuscript in '97, ended up in Philadelphia, and there you can read that the whole mountain goes up in the air, so to say, castle and everything. That's actually quite accurate, in the sense that the location that Stoker picked was an extinct volcano, and a big one. It was one of the largest volcanoes in Europe, with a diameter of the ridge of the let's say the ridge of the volcano that was 10 kilometers in diameter. So it was a really huge one, but it is already dead since 5 million years. But somehow the region was already known in his time as volcanic, and there were already reports, for example, that sulfur could be found in that region. There was a sulfur mine. So that is accurate in a geological sense. It's surprising.
I thought that was the part of the whole story that made it an amazing story for me, that at the end of it, it was a dormant volcano where he had placed Castle Dracula.
Yeah, it was. It is. It's called the Kalimani Mountains. It has a caldera. This ridge. It is one of the youngest regions in the Carpathians, and the only region in the Carpathians that is actually of volcanic origin. And I think maybe Stoker some way read about the volcanic properties of the area and thought, well, might be a good place to put a castle on and later have it explode and go up in the air.
Well, you did some similar research with the characters in the book Dracula, too. You mentioned the title character, but let's save him for just a second. We've saved the star of the show, and let's talk about Van Helsing, because you think you may have found an identity for Van Helsing.
Today, I rather tend to Max Muller, Professor Max Muller from Oxford. But I started out with a suspicion that was just after I traveled to that mountain in April, May 2012. I found a little clue in a biography, an autobiography written by a Dutch-American filmmaker, Tony van Rentergem. And he said his grandfather, Albert van Rentergem, he was the role model for Van Helsing. And this Albert van Rentergem, he actually was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, but he specialized on hypnosis. And he founded, I think, 86, 87 or something, he founded a clinic for hypnotical treatment in Amsterdam. And this clinic was quite famous. Everyone in Europe that was involved in hypnosis knew about this clinic. And he also had a partner, was also quite famous, Frederick van Eden, a Dutch poet and writer, and also a socialist. So it was not improbable was not impossible, at least, that Stoker would have heard of this person or these two doctors that were specialized in Amsterdam in hypnotical treatment, and used them to describe Van Helsing.
And there's a couple competing theories on that, correct? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the big but is I never found a hard proof. There were a lot of friends they had in common. For example, the publisher of Stoker, Heinemann, William Heinemann. He also published books by Frederick van Eden. They had a lot of common friends in the publishing scene because Stoker not only was a theater manager and a writer, he also traded in rights for Heinemann. They had a little company. And although there were a lot of cross connections, I never could prove that they met or that there was any letters. There were no diary entries. This Van Rentergem, he wrote a 1,200-page autobiography on his life. Obviously, he never mentioned Stoker or Dracula. So in the end, I had to give up, although there were so many promising leads. And then I thought, okay, let's look at the other candidates again. And at that time, Dacre told me that Stoker's son, Noel, had been to boarding school in Oxford. And that's, okay, that made some connection with me, because that would mean if his son is in boarding school, probably once a year he travels there to pick up his son or to bring back to school. And the other connection is that Carfax, the Carfax building of Count Dracula, is also taken from a building in Oxford, the Carfax building. They have the same properties, high tower, chapel, rebuilt over the centuries, little window only high up. So that all pointed to Oxford. And Stoker met Muller a couple of times, once in Oxford, once Muller was in the Lyceum Theatre for an evening with Franz Liszt. There's no proof either. There's no hard proof. There's no note where Stoker says, "Oh yes, must be Muller." But German professor specialized in history would fit the profile of Muller. So this is one of the big mysteries that still remains. I'm not sure either, but this is the most probable candidate I could find in the end.
That'd be fascinating if we could pinpoint Van Helsing, because after Dracula, he might be the most important character in the book, and I think a lot of people would be really fascinated to know who exactly Stoker based him on, if not the multiple people that Stoker based him on.
Well, it's I think it's based on multiple persons. There was also someone proposed Roosevelt from the United States. Someone proposed another doctor who was close to Florence. There are a lot of candidates that would fit, but in the end, it is not possible to really pin it down, I'm afraid. If someone really could find it out, I think I would draw my hat and say, okay, good research. I spent a year on it and was not sure in the end.
Do you think Van Helsing's name is derived from Elsinore?
Yeah, that would be probable, because it's not a Dutch name. If you check in the Dutch name list, there's no one called Van Helsing. There's one guy in Germany, I think. So Elsinore, Van Helsing would be logical, a logical connection.
I found it interesting to see someone make that Shakespearean connection.
Mm-hmm. Sure, Stoker was heavily involved in Shakespeare. The Lyceum Theatre where he worked, where he was the manager, was specialized in remakes of Shakespeare with Irving in all the main roles. So
sure,
would be very probable he took it from Shakespeare.
By the way, it's nice to hear that you're safe from vampires where you are, because I can hear the rooster crowing in the background.
Ah, okay. Microphone is working. Sure, that's what wakes him up every morning.
Well, let's talk about one of the things you're most famous for, which is some of the translations and serializations of Dracula. Let's start small with some of the serializations. How many times was Dracula serialized in the newspapers, do we think? Because I'm sure we don't know for sure.
I can list them for you. It's easier. I don't know the number in my head, but the early serializations started in Hungary already on 1 January 1898. So that was about 6 months after Dracula was released and reviewed by the London press. It was an Hungarian translation. It was very faithful to the original text. There were just a very few deviations I found. And it was only discovered in 2010, I think, by Professor Farkas from Budapest, a Romanian professor working in Budapest. He found out that this was the earliest translation of Dracula we know so far. Until then, we thought it was the Icelandic version. That's what Richard Dalby thought when he discovered it in '86. And it has been considered like the first foreign version of Dracula ever for decades. Hungary came first. Then there was a serialization in English or in American in Chicago that started in May 1999. That was also unknown until I discovered it 2 years ago. And after that we have the Swedish serializations and translations, and they are not real translations, they are modifications. And after that we have Icelandic. Icelandic version was a translation of one of the Swedish variants. There were two, one shorter, one longer, and the Icelandic version, marked Mikrana, was published, started 13 January 1900, and was based on the shorter Swedish version. So these are the four most intriguing ones, and the ones that pose the question to what amount, to what degree was Stoker involved in these productions.
Well, let's start with, I'll start with where I'm the most familiar, which is the Icelandic version that you did the translation on, or you crowdsourced the translation, is that correct?
That's correct, because I didn't speak any Icelandic. I couldn't understand anything of it. I put something in the Google translator, and that's how I could find out that it was not a true translation, because there were characters and scenes that did not turn up in Dracula, in the original Dracula. So I already knew that there was a difference, but to really translate it to English, I needed help. And it worked very well. I put a post on Facebook in various Icelandic groups and asked people to help me. And I split the whole manuscript. It's about 55,000 words, I think, in Icelandic. I split it in 25 pieces and sent it out to these people. Everyone got 2,000 words, and they sent it back.
Well, let's talk about Makt Makrana a little bit more, which translates to Powers of Darkness. Dracula is the villain in this, but it's told a lot different than the Dracula we're familiar with, and we don't have to go through a step-by-step plot summary, but give me the overview. What at first glance, what's a reader going to say, whoa, this is different? What was your first clue that you were reading something very different?
There was something about a blonde girl in the first part of Dracula. I mean, there's also a blonde vampire girl in Dracula itself, but this person was turning up several times in the whole story. It was not just one kind of assault on Harker, but Harker was looking out for her, trying to meet her in secret, although the Count did forbid it. And that was, of course, a very interesting difference.
So for anyone who hasn't read it, in the original Dracula, there's the three vampire brides,
Yeah.
And in Powers of Darkness, there is the one blonde, nameless vampire girl who Harker
Yes.
lusts after. I mean,
Yeah.
he really wants to find her again.
Yeah. He's obsessed. He's kind of hypnotized maybe by her. He tries to keep loyal to Mina in his mind, but he cannot stop himself.
It gets a little steamy. It gets a little steamy in some of those scenes.
Yeah, they get together. She is kneeling down before him. She's sitting on his lap. She's kissing him in the neck, and all the time she asks him, "Please take down that crucifix that you took from." No, she doesn't know that, but he took it from Bistritza, from the old lady in the inn. And she also warns him. That's very interesting. She's warning him for the Count, and they kind of have a little conspiracy. Like the Count is the punishing daddy, and they are the young couple that tries to get together, although daddy is forbidding it. A very interesting and new dynamic compared to the original Dracula.
And Dracula also has sort of a blood cult that lives underneath his castle in this one.
Yeah, that's the other very big surprise. I mean, the first part, the Transylvanian adventure of Jonathan Harker. First of all, it's much longer,
much bigger.
Than
yes.
Much bigger. He has extended it, and the adventure in the basement of the castle is one big part of that. He makes an exploration tour, goes through a lot of different rooms. It is described very precisely, and later he finds a secret door, because there's another thing. There's an old housekeeper in this first part of Dracula that brings him his food, and she always shows up and disappears, and he doesn't know where did she come from. So she always pops up, and then he starts suspecting there must be some secret entrance, and he finds it, and he goes down the stairs, and then he finds this basement, and there the Count is dressed up in a red cape, and there are about 150 men and women, naked, half naked. It's tan skin and hair like straw and ape-like faces, and they are celebrating a ceremony where three innocent, I assume innocent, girls are they are chained. They're brought to a kind of altar, a big black stone, and then one of the apes bites her in the neck. So it's not the Count who bites, but it is one of these ape-like monsters that does this.
Yeah, because the Count never bites anybody. I hope I'm not giving too much away, but the Count never bites anybody in Macht Makrana.
No. He is even not called a vampire. The whole vampire dependence on blood, being cursed to walk in the shadows till the end of times, that whole thing is taken out in the Icelandic version, also in the Swedish version. Instead, the Count, he is a politician. He is conspiring with other aristocrats in France, in England, to overthrow the democratic institutions. And he never shows really a large interest. So it is more of his followers that are killing and drinking blood, and he stays more distant from that, and instead he focuses on getting power. That is his big addiction to.
And to me, that's a much scarier story. You have a person hell-bent on power who has a very clear motivation. His followers are willing to do grisly, disgusting things for him. That's a scarier tale to me than one person who likes to drink blood.
Yeah, he has much higher ambitions. He is a social Darwinist. He wants to have the rule of the strong, which also means, of course, his friends, the vampires. And it is, in the end, it is the secret police that has to help uncover the diplomatic scandal that is behind this. I think it's a very interesting twist and makes Dracula also a more public person. In the original novel, he always stays in the background. The whole London and Whitby period, you never see him coming out, except the scene at Piccadilly where there's a confrontation with Van Helsing's men, but for the rest he's always hidden. And in the Swedish version and also the Icelandic version, he has a beautiful Carfax house where he hosts a big party with dozens of foreign aristocrats and diplomats, and he is the leader of this sect, so to say, and of this conspiracy. Makes him a much stronger person in the end than Stoker's Dracula.
Well, before I gush about it too much, because I really do like the Icelandic version, there's a weird issue with it, which is that last third, which is written so, it's almost written like a summary of a longer book. Why do you think that is?
For that, you have to go back to the Swedish version, because there were, as I told you, two Swedish versions. The one that was longer and all kept in diary style was published in Dagen, a newspaper. And then there was a shorter version that started in August 1999, a magazine that's called Halvvecko Upplaga. It means it is a magazine that appears twice per week. Aftonbladets Halvvecka Upplaga. Don't ask me if the pronunciation is right. And there already, the story switches after the Transylvanian part from diary style to normal conventional style with chapters. And Asmundsson in Iceland, he translated that version and shortened it even further. And that really reads like a summary. And I think he was getting tired with the story. It has been in his Fjalkunan for more than a year. And maybe he wanted to make place for a new novel and just compressed it and sped it up so that he could end the story.
Yeah, I couldn't help wondering when I read it if there was a deadline approaching and they just said, just get the thing done, get it out the door.
Well, he was the publisher of his own newspaper, so he couldn't decide on it. But maybe he made a promise to another author, I will take your story on, or maybe there was not enough positive feedback from his readers that he said that it was worth the place in his newspaper in that length, because if he would have published it, let's say, exactly after the Swedish version, it would have taken 2 years, you know. That's maybe too long for as an attention span for readers to keep following it.
Well, the plot points are all there. It's got no poetry to it, but the plot points are there. If someone ever were to try to pick it up and film it or do something else with it, that last third does have a good story to it. You just have to fill in the prose yourself.
Just after the book came out, there was a Swedish filmmaker. I forgot his name, but he has been in the business for decades already. And he said he wanted to set up a Dracula series playing in London based on this Icelandic count, who is a manipulator, a diplomat, a power broker, and show this side of the Dracula character. So I never saw it announced as a ready series, but that was the talk in 2017.
Yeah, I remember seeing something about it got optioned and then it looked like nothing ever happened with it. And usually if 2 years go by with an option and nothing happens, maybe it's gone nowhere.
He wouldn't need an option because the story is in the public domain, so everyone,
I suppose,
can make some movie based on the Icelandic Dracula. I wouldn't even be involved probably, but
well, don't tell people that.
Okay, please cut it from that. The amazing thing is it's all taking place in London. After the Whitby part, it takes place in London and it ends there. and it ends there in the basement of a house owned by the Count, where Van Helsing and his men intrude and kill the Count. And the riddle about that is that the same shortening and the same construction we find back in the movie and in the preceding stage plays, where the Count has his Carfax Abbey, and the crew of Light Van Helsing kills the Count still in the cellars in the basement of Carfax Abbey. So I wondered.
And that's not the only thing. You just remind me of something else, because the Count in Macmacrana also wears a tuxedo. Doesn't he?
He wears. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. There are pictures in the Swedish version. You can see it at the evening party in Carfax. The Count is wearing tuxedo. Everyone is wearing formal dresses. The ladies have nice long dresses, and he's the host of a formal evening party, a reception, or a meeting where he demonstrates some of his hypnotic skills, and he looks actually like the Count from the 1931 movie.
Isn't that interesting? So let me be a conspiracy theorist for just a second here. Is there any chance that Dean and Balderston, when they were writing the play, saw this version of Dracula, or someone told them about it and they adopted some of this?
That was my question. I never found any proof for it. The other, let's say, explanation would be to say, well, it's the only way to shorten the plot. Cut out this whole voyage to Europe and Transylvania and Moldavia, and just let the Count be a socialite in London. But it is the parallels are striking. Maybe this Swedish version survived some way, came to England. I'm not sure about it. I didn't find any proof, but it might be a possibility.
Well, you've studied the Swedish version, you've studied the Icelandic version. I think one of the big questions that a lot of folks have argued over is how much, if any, input or knowledge did Bram Stoker have on these versions? What's your view?
By now, I have another view than I had at the beginning.
Oh, walk me through that. Walk me through your view at the beginning and your view now.
At the beginning, I was puzzled by the preface. That was the text I was focusing on, and that was putting out a riddle, because I was corresponding with a guy in Iceland, Asker Jansen. He was the editor of the Icelandic version, the third Icelandic version of Macmacrana, I would say. And he told me that the Icelandic of this preface didn't sound natural, didn't sound as if an Icelandic guy had written it. And there were words like secret police that didn't even exist in Icelandic. So after the Icelandic rules of language purity, they had to find an Icelandic expression for secret police that did not exist in Iceland at that time. So he was convinced, and I later asked a lot of language experts, translation experts, linguistic professors at University of Reykjavik, and they all confirmed, yes, it sounds like a translation. And because I didn't think that it might come from Sweden, I assumed, okay, there must have been an English language manuscript that was translated by Asmundsen. And that means Stoker must have something to do with this Icelandic version. That was my first suspicion, and I tried to map out all kinds of connections again between Stoker and Iceland, about Icelanders working at Oxford and so on. But again, like with the Verwentergem thing, I never found a hard proof that Stoker knew Asmundsen or that they had exchanged letters or something. And then what made me change my mind is that when the Swedish version came into the discussion, it was after my book was published. A Swedish scholar, Rickard Bergman, said, hey, this reminds me of a Swedish story that I read last year, also called Powers of Darkness. And in the Swedish version, I found out, took me a while, that the preface was longer than in the Icelandic version, and that especially this longer part, the extended part, was plagiarized from the diary of a priest, Bernard Wadström, a Lutheran priest living in Stockholm, who had just published his memoirs, I think the second or third part of his memoirs, in March 1999. 3 months later, you see the preface of Mörkrets Makter, the Swedish version, with exactly the same phrasing about the need to examine the things that we don't understand and so on. It's obvious that there was a copying, and I don't think that Stoker did it. He couldn't read Swedish, so he couldn't have put these hints into the Swedish preface. And that makes me think that the editor of the Swedish version must have pulled a little trick, copied these lines from the priest, maybe as a practical joke, maybe because just to make fun of him. And if the preface, of course, is written by a Swedish guy or woman instead of Bram Stoker, whose name is under it, then the whole story may have been written by someone in Sweden, not by Stoker. I also tried to find out who was the editor, because there was only a synonym, no, not a synonym, a pseudonym, A.E., written A.E., and I found out it could have been Andersen Ederberg, a senior Swedish journalist. And I found a lot of topics that appear in the Swedish version. I found them back in a magazine where this journalist had been writing for in the 1870s. So that also suggested to me these ideas, the mentioning of certain operas, for example, came from Sweden, not from Stoker.
So if all of that is true, my only question then is, how do we explain the existence of certain small details that only existed in Stoker's notes that somehow made it into these versions? And I'm thinking, for example, of the police detective whose name appears in the Icelandic version, was in Stoker's notes but was never in the English publication of Dracula. How does that happen?
That's the big riddle that still remains. I discovered these parallels in 2014, I think. I wrote the first essay for the Transylvanian Society of Dracula, the letter from Castle Dracula. And in that essay, I already outlined 7 similarities between Stoker's early notes and the Icelandic version, because the Icelandic version, of course, has the same similarities as the Swedish version. And I said, okay, that was another clue, except for the preface that looked like a translation. That was the other clue that made me say, okay, Stoker must have been involved. He must have put in his early ideas, maybe sent an early draft of Dracula to Iceland. But when I found out about the preface being copied from the diaries of a priest, I had to rethink that, of course.
It sounds like there's a lot more of this riddle that needs to be unwrapped.
Sure. It is the thing that still is standing out as a mystery. And I know that the Swedish guy, Rickard Bergman, who is now going to translate the longer Swedish version for us to English, he is still convinced that Stoker was somehow involved through people he knew in Stockholm. He also quotes the similarities with the notes. And I think he's going to present something about Anglicisms in the Swedish version that would also point to a translation from an English text. I cannot judge it because I can translate or decipher the Swedish, but I cannot discover Anglicisms in it. I would have to be a native speaker for that. So this discussion is still open.
There's a Turkish version as well that I was just looking at last year. I know that's not your area of focus, but that Turkish version got really creative with the adaptations as well. What do you think it is about Dracula that makes people want to take that license and expand on it or adapt it to wherever they live?
It's a story, I think it's a story of power and of sexuality. Both ingredients are there, and that makes it so interesting, because Dracula is a guy who can not only seduce a woman, but he can force her to love him, more or less, or to turn into another being against her will. Lucy turns against a kind of voluptuous monster, and I think that touches a fantasy, a very deep fantasy about power and about sex that just appeals to a lot of people in other cultures, and they wanted to rewrite the story in their way so that it is even more convincing for their readers. So the Tale of Dracula has been going on since Stoker published it. I mean, there's been vampires before, of course, Varney the Vampire or Polydori's Vampire, Camilla, but this all-inclusive power, for example, to turn Mina, who is a very prude Victorian woman, to turn her into a kind of monster that wants to be with Dracula, that follows him all the way to Transylvania. I think that appeals to a very deep, emotional spot in everyone, and that's the thing that asks for new versions.
Well, no one was really paying attention to the Icelandic version until you took a look at it, and no one was really looking at the Turkish version until a few years back. Is it possible there's some other translations out there that are radically different that just haven't been on the English-speaking radar?
Sure. I'm in contact with a professor in India, in Calcutta, Pradosh Bhattacharya, when I say it right. He and one of his students, they worked on analyzing a Bengali version of Dracula, which is also very different. In that version, homoerotic relations and the bond between men plays a much larger version than in the English Dracula.
Fascinating. What year did that come out?
I think that was the 40s or something. I would have to look it up. It was a bit later than the Turkish version, and it has never been discussed anywhere. I'm trying to put together a book together with Magda, my partner for doing the conferences in Brasov, and he is contributing this essay to it. So maybe there's still others. I'm not sure. Maybe, of course, we know about the Hammer films, about all the later adaptations, hundreds of adaptations that have come up, but this would still belong to the earlier adaptations before Dracula was virtually everywhere.
Let's talk about your find when you were doing some of your other Dracula research. You came across an identity or an inspiration for the character of Dracula who was not Vlad the Impaler. Who did you come up with? Who did you find?
I found Michael the Brave, which is a ruler of Moldavia, Transylvania, and Wallachia. He ruled over the three countries for a short period of time. He lived around 200 years later than Dracula. And he corresponds to the other of the Dracula race that crossed the Danube and conquered a part of Turkey land. Vlad the Impaler never was successful in driving the Turks really back. Well, Michael the Brave, he came all the way to the south of Bulgaria, Adrianopolis. So he is a candidate that Stoker took notes on. He read about it in Wilkinson's book. And he corresponds to how Dracula himself in the novel describes the other of his race, who in a later age was inspired by the first one.
The passage you're talking about is when Dracula is he's showing Harker around his castle, and he is sort of waxing poetic about his heritage, and he says, "Oh, that great time," and I'm paraphrasing here, "that great other of the Dracula race crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own land." Now, someone like me reads that, and I think he's talking about himself, but he doesn't want to reveal that he's that old because he's trying to, cover that up. But you saw that as being quite literal, as another human being, not me, but another human being. Is that right?
Well, Dracula may have been, let's say, the reincarnation or the form of Michael the Brave after his death, because he has a personal past. That's what Van Helsing clarifies. He was, during his life, someone with a great brain and one of the bravest of the sons of the people across the forest and so on. So he must have had, according to the novel, a personal past. And there are two persons presented that Dracula presents. The first is what we know as Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III. And then he switches over to this other of the Dracula race that lived in a later age. So if Dracula has a personal past, it must be the other of this race, because in chapter 25, now I come to my discovery, in chapter 5, Van Helsing is suddenly completely excited because he has found a little passage in Jonathan Harker's diary in which the Count refers to the other of the Dracula race, and he and Mina identify Count Dracula, who's fleeing from London all the way to the Black Sea, as this person who is describing himself. So if you look at the text, if you close read it, there's no other way than to conclude that this other of the Dracula race is Count Dracula.
And there's this moment in the castle where Jonathan Harker fears that Dracula is going to shed his identity and adopt Harker's identity. So would this be consistent with his character? He maybe had shed the identity of Michael the Brave way back in history and adopted the identity of Dracula. Maybe is he just an identity switcher? Could we read him that way?
Yeah, that would be a good description. He is. You see it also in the Swedish version. Very interesting. The Count switches names. First he is Baron Sekeli, and then later he is Caroman Rubiano. So he switches names already during his couple of months in London.
Interesting.
And yeah, Dracula is a shapeshifter, and he's also a persona shifter, but he stays Dracula for centuries, of course, because he can do that in this castle.
There's this tradition in the Gothic of the double. Was Stoker kind of being meta when he made Dracula a double as well?
He may have been inspired, or I mean, it was a trope in literature of that time, and that they have this mysterious double that has some fateful influence on someone's life. But I also think it's a literary trick. I think he's distracting us. First, he's putting the attention on the historical Dracula, who had this brother who betrayed him to the Turks and brought the shame of slavery and so on onto the Romanian people. And of course, everyone is focusing on this person, and like McNally Floresco say, "Oh, this is Dracula. This must be Dracula. You know, it must be Vlad the Impaler." I mean, you can identify him, but he keeps one option open to slip out of this link by already introducing this other of the Dracula race in his first conversation with Harker on this topic. And then later in chapter 25, Van Helsing and Mina make this switch. I think he didn't want to have a Dracula role model, so to say, that could be easily identified, just like he didn't want to have a location for Castle Dracula that could be easily identified. All the locations, essential locations in the novel, are coded, are hidden, are obscured. And I think that's the same trick he pulled on us with the identity of Dracula.
Have you found much support for this theory, or are other scholars buying it?
It's in the book. It's in the book. It is, in my view, it's undeniable. I mean, you can, of course, speculate that Stoker thought something different from that what he wrote. But if you look at the text of the book, look at chapter 25, it is undeniable that Dracula, the one that's fleeing from London with the boat back to his homeland, is the other of his race, because it's Van Helsing and Mina that make this identification, not me. That it is Michael the Brave, of course, is speculation, but if you look at the voivodes, the leaders of Romania that actually fought with the Turks, there were not so many. After Vlad the Impaler, there was only one other one that really battled with the Turks, but he's not mentioned in the notes. And the only one that actually battled with the Turks lived later, crossed the Danube into Turkey land, on which Stoker took notes in his notes. That is Michael the Brave. So I think he had it in mind as a reference point, but he decided again to leave out the name because he doesn't want someone to sue him and say, "Hey, you're smearing the name of my great-great-grandfather, or you're smearing the name of one of Romania's greatest heroes." So he obscured it, made it invisible.
That's fascinating. What do you think is the biggest unsolved mystery in Dracula right now? What would you love to get a midnight phone call from somebody with a hot lead on?
Van Helsing is still unsolved. If someone could really prove one way or the other this person would have been the role model for Van Helsing, I would be very interested in that. And the other thing is the still ongoing dispute I have with Richard Berghorn about the influence that Stoker may have had on the Swedish version. If he was involved, if he authorized it, if he sent a manuscript or not, it's still an open question. I think Stoker was not involved. It was a piracy, a very high quality piracy. Berghorn thinks Stoker was instrumental in this version. So I will have to wait till Richard publishes his book and publishes a new essay about these alleged Anglicisms. I'm very curious to read about that.
I can't wait to read more about it and hear where it goes from there.
I will sure comment on his book. I don't know, he said he has some reputed publisher. I don't know which one, he doesn't tell to the public yet, but he announced that it will be forthcoming. Once it is out, I'm sure the press will react, I will react. We have, for a conference, we have our own Facebook group, Children of the Night. I'm sure there will be comments there. A lot of other Facebook groups dealing with Dracula will comment on it. And I have a website, vampvaultjimdo.com, where I update my research when something new comes up. So there's a summary of all the things I've done till now. And as soon as this comes out, I will comment on it.
And we'll put links down below this YouTube video to both your website and the Children of the Night website, and of course, to your translation of Powers of Darkness as well.
Please do. It's still in the market.
And it is a good read for anyone out there who enjoys Dracula. Powers of Darkness, aka Mactmer Krana, is a really good read. I recommend it.
Yeah, I enjoyed the story myself. Otherwise, I would never have taken out 3 years just to produce that book. You know, if you don't love that story, it would be a waste of time, because financially, of course, it's not a big thing that catapults me into stardom or richness or something. Right. I love the story. I love the interaction between Harker and this blonde vampire girl, and the Count making little sarcastic jokes all the time. Really good read. I like it more than Dracula.
And I love listening to the Children of the Night making that music behind you. Your puppy dog out there.
We have 4 dogs, and the neighbors have, I think, 8 dogs. So if you don't hear the roosters in the morning, okay. You can listen to the dogs.
It sounds nice and warm where you are.
It is. It is during the day, afternoon, 35 degrees, 36 degrees, humidity 60. So it is. It's a place I choose to be, because Munich was no longer affordable if you live as a freelance author, writer. So I moved here. I was born in Indonesia, so I have a connection to Asia. I'm just a little bit away from my birthplace here.
So you work full time on Dracula studies? Is that what you do for a living?
That's already the wording points to the problem. I was and still am nearly full time in Dracula studies since 2010, since I started this series, but I never made a living with it. We got some royalties, of course, from Powers of Darkness, but that is maybe the rent of 2 months in Munich or something. I worked 3 years in the book. So here in the Philippines, life is much more affordable, and it's warm. I like it to be warm if it's not too hot. And I'm working here too. I published the essay on Van Helsing from here. I published the essay on Bernard Wadstrom about the Swedish preface from here. I published my essays on Addison Ederberg from here. But now I'm working on a novel, because after 10 years in this research, you see, okay, you reach a certain amount of people that are really interested, but there's not even a market. I wrote a Dracula travel guide. I asked my agent, do you think we could find a publisher for this? And she told me, there's just not enough demand worldwide to get your book published. So I'm working on a novel now. I'm nearly done, and I hope that will be my new way of using my research skills to entertain people.
I wish you good luck, and I hope you'll let me know when it's all done.
Sure. I need to find an agent. I'm done with the manuscript, 100,000 words. Illustrations, of course. I cannot write the text without illustrating it. That's my background as a photographer. Probably as soon as it's coming out, I will let you know, or when I have a book contract, and you can pay attention to that. Great. No vampires. No vampires this time.
That's okay. That's okay. Well, Hans Corneel De Roos, the Sherlock of Dracula, thank you so much for being here today and helping shine some light on some of these mysteries. Some of these mysteries we didn't even know were mysteries until you told us about them.
I'm happy. I'm happy to dig in the deep and to find things that people didn't suspect. And the website is more or less my legacy. If I don't continue with new mysteries, I wouldn't know right now what to research, except what I just told you about, the origins of the Swedish version. Apart from that, I didn't find anything that I thought, okay, I need to dive into that and find that out. So it's a rounded body of work, I hope, and I hope people will always consult it and enjoy it.
Well, Hans, thank you so much. This was great. I've been admiring your work from afar for a while, so it's amazing to be able to talk to you in person.
I'm very happy to meet you. No, I hope we were able to make a very nice clip together, and people will enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much, and take care, and please stay safe. Thanks again to Hans Corneel De Roos, and I'll try to say it in the Dutch manner, Hans Corneel De Roos. Now, if I didn't say that right, what can I say? I'm American, whose flag is on the moon. Anyway, take a look below, if you can, at the links to Hans's website, to his conferences that he runs, as well as a link to purchase Powers of Darkness. Listen, Hans is too modest to say this, but there's a reason that the guy lives in the Philippines. It's because Dracula Studies doesn't bring in the bank. The guy's doing really hard work. If you can throw the guy a few nickels by purchasing his book, it is a good read, and I'm not saying that because he was here on the webcast. I read Powers of Darkness. I thought it was great. I think it really makes this story come alive, and I will stand on Bram Stoker's coffee table and say this. I think there are parts of Powers of Darkness that are superior to the original publication of Dracula. Yeah. If you don't like that, you come find me here hiding in my basement, and we'll have a civil discussion about that over tea, all right? That's what I thought. Anyway, thanks for being here for this. Subscribe. You'll find out if there actually are more of these webcasts. I hope there are, but I'm also kind of eager to have some sort of income in my life, so we'll find out what happens. I don't mean to sound fatalistic about it, but we're all going to die.